Hello, welcome to Devex at COP. Hello, welcome to Devex at COP26. I'm Kate Warren. We're here to bring you inside the conversations happening both inside and outside of Glasgow for what many think is the most critical moment for addressing the climate crisis before it is too late. COP is back after a brief pause last year due to the pandemic. Many are saying we're living in a dual pandemic of the COVID crisis and the climate crisis and growing inequity that is really impacting the lower middle income countries the most. That is what we're here to talk about over the next couple of days. I have my colleague here, UK correspondent Will Worley, who is on the ground reporting on what is happening. We have a couple of days of some really exciting conversations and interviews for you today. For those of you that are joining via Zoom, you can access interpretation in French and Spanish or closed captioning to go to the bottom of your screen. So make sure you take advantage of that. And I would like to thank our innovation and ecosystem partner, DAI UK, as well as our ecosystem partners, AGRA, Catapult, Center for Disease Protection, ESRI, and RTI International, and our program underwriter, FHI 360, for helping to make this coverage possible. So thank you for your support. But I would like to kick off with you, Will. You know, a lot of our audience is really curious about what is happening here. What is COP? Our community hasn't always been a really active presence necessarily at this conference. So give us a sense, what is happening? Where are we? What are all these people doing here?
That's a really good question. So right now, Kate, we are in the green zone. This is the area of the COP that is open to the public. You still have to go through all the security and the procedures to get in, but this is for the public section. So here are kind of private section delegations, universities, researchers, private companies. About 10 minutes over that way, we have the blue zone. The blue zone is where the negotiations take place. That's a little bit more exclusive, if you will. That's where the media center is. That's where country pavilions are. And that's where you'll see politicians walking around right next to you, like John Kerry, Samantha Power, and we just saw Gordon Brown this morning. So this is kind of the COP26 official sections. We also have thousands and thousands of protesters all over outside in the streets who want to make their voices heard as well.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point because there are a lot of people who have felt left out of this conversation. There's a big movement in Indigenous voices. There are some people who are very optimistic about these couple of weeks, some that are really skeptical. What have been the conversations you've been having so far? What's the temperature in the rooms here?
It's interesting. I understand there is kind of a bit of a growing trust deficit between the lower income nations and the higher income nations. One of the key issues that is around is about something called loss and damage. This is about the climate impacts which have harmed people that can't be adapted to, the disasters that are on the way that have already happened. This is a really sensitive subject for many complex kind of historical readings. Devex has done quite a bit of reporting on this that everyone at home can go and check out to get some background. Something that's been really key for that this week is the Scottish Government have made a dedicated £1 million donation specifically towards loss and damage finance, which hasn't happened before. Climate finance is usually in the buckets of mitigation, reducing carbon fumes, and adaptations, which is dealing with the changes in a preparatory kind of way. So Scotland have been praised by the lower income countries for kind of leading the way on this loss and damage financing. It remains to be kind of seen how much more will be added to that £1 million, which isn't going to do so much itself. Many countries want to see a dedicated kind of financial mechanism. But on the other side, outside of finance, there has also been some kind of there has been some progress on the operationalizing the Santiago network for loss and damage, which is about technical support. So the loss and damage is a really key thing for our audience to be aware of this week. Adaptation has gone up the agenda. Traditionally, that has been kind of mitigations, little brother receiving less money, less space on the agenda. That's changed this week. We've had the huge prepare announcement of President's resilience and emergency plan for climate adaptation. We'll have to check if I've got the acronym right there.
Lots of acronyms flying around.
There's lots of acronyms flying around. There's, some better than others, it has to be said. That's something that people should be aware of, and does feel like there has been a bit of progress on this week. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding. This is about ultimately the negotiations that are taking place in that blue zone, the hard work of officials and ministers going day and night to try and find some common ground in these talks.
Okay, great. Well, I know we have several really exciting conversations happening, some interviews you've done, and our colleagues around the world, talking to people around the world that couldn't physically be here in Glasgow. Any highlights that you're really looking forward to? Any conversation that you think
my conversation with Salim Lahouk, who's been a fantastic advocate for climate justice for many, many years. He's been to every COP there's been, 26 of them. And once you get here, you kind of understand how big and kind of complex these events are. He is fantastically knowledgeable, and I think he can speak really well about some of the issues that relate to the lower income countries. We have, in completely the other side of the spectrum, we have Priti Sinha, who is head of the UN Capital Development Fund, talking about the finance piece. We also have Asif Saleh, also from Bangladesh, head of BRAC, the largest NGO in the world.
All right, well, a lot to look forward to. Thank you, Will, and stay tuned over the next couple of days, and we'll pass it off and get started with our first panel. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending upon where you are joining us from today. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to host our first conversation of the day. Today, we are going to be talking about coffee, which I know is something that's an intimate part of everyone's lives. I must confess, right at the very beginning of this panel, I am not a daily coffee drinker, and I know that puts me really outside the realm of most humans on this planet. But today we're going to be talking about coffee and the intimate links to sustainability and how climate change is affecting coffee, which of course is a primary crop for many agriculturists around the world, grown in many regions around the world. I'm thrilled today to be joined by three expert speakers. We have with us David Browning, who's the CEO of Enveritas, and we have Anmol Van Mali, who's the Director of Sustainable Finance at Winrock International. And we also have with us Moises Gonzalez, who's the head of the Latin American Caribbean Regional Program based in Nicaragua at Christian Aid. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. It is nice to see you all. David, I want to come to you first for a little bit of a scene setter when it comes to this topic. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about Enveritas's model, what you do, and how you are intimately focused on linking coffee farmers in particular to sustainable practices.
Great, thanks, and thanks, Teresa, for hosting this session. Enveritas provides sustainability assurance for supply chains for large multinationals, but has looked to re-engineer this process compared to the situation we were in about 5 years ago, where a relatively modest number of farmers were able to participate in the process. And that's not because they didn't necessarily have sustainable practices, but because the actual processes of being able to measure whether a farmer was undertaking sustainable practices or not was quite expensive. And so the opportunity that existed was to utilize changes that have occurred in technology over the last 5 years to be able to bring that cost down, actually make it completely free for farmers, but be able to do a rigorous sustainability assessment that would let farmers participate in the market. And this was important for a couple of reasons. One is the sustainability was important for farmers themselves to protect their farms and their environment for their family and for the future generations. But it was also important for them to be able to access markets, because what we didn't want in a world where there were really two groups of coffee farmers that had access to the sustainability markets were increasingly growing, and then farmers who were shut out from that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, right? Where, we oftentimes in the West don't necessarily think of, where the coffee is coming from, right? And you do unfortunately have those two tiers often of, people that are able to follow those practices that have access to that sort of market, and then smallholders that perhaps don't. And so, how you sort of navigate that and focus on bringing everyone in to, the sustainable market and giving everyone access to a place where they can actually get a livable wage for their crop, et cetera, and, ensure that everyone is able to participate in that. Anmol, I'd like to come next to you to hear a little bit about how Winrock is working, on the coffee issue. You're, an expert in thinking about, sort of sector-specific sustainability, and so, coffee, of course, being one sector of the food system. How does Winrock think about, sort of coffee individually, as well as its model of sort of thinking about sector-specific sustainability growth?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Windrock International, by way of introduction, is a global nonprofit, and our mission is to empower the disadvantaged, increase economic growth opportunities, and sustain natural resources. And you can't really achieve any of that without turning your attention to the agricultural sector, which has really been the mainstay of Windrock for the past 40 years. As far as our approach to agriculture, as in general, is concerned, um, a lot of our work goes in improving access to markets, in increasing entrepreneurship opportunities, and improving value chains. Within the climate change realm, we work on both the mitigation and adaptation side because the agricultural land use sector provides opportunities for both and challenges for both. So we have one of the leading teams that works on understanding the intersection of the land use and agriculture sector with carbon emissions and what the carbon sequestration and reduction potential there is. But simultaneously, because of the linkages of agriculture and climate adaptation and economic resilience, a lot of our work increasingly is going towards ensuring that agriculture value chains, especially those that involve smallholder farmers, are being positioned to be resilient in a changing climate. And coffee happens to be a favorite topic for many windrockers because it's the fuel that drives our daily routine. And a lot of our work happens in that sector. I personally lead a project in Indonesia, which looks at climate resilience in the Arabica coffee bean specialty in northern Sumatra. And we clearly see ways in which the learnings from that can be applicable to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think that really is sort of the compelling piece of the coffee issue, right? Is because it is something that touches on us all most days. And I had the opportunity actually to connect with your CEO from Winrock, Rodney Ferguson, last month in New York at the UN General Assembly, and we were talking a little bit about this coffee piece and some of the programming. And I write about food systems, and so we've at Devex really been working to explore all aspects of that. And obviously, the connection to COP is the sustainability piece, the impact on climate. And Rodney was telling me about some of the work you guys have done in Myanmar in terms of really connecting farmers to the market and helping farmers sort of figure out, okay, this is the way I've always grown my, crops, and this is the practices that I use, but how can we really capitalize on the knowledge they already have, increase yields while being sustainable, and give them access to markets? Moises, I'd love to come to you next to hear a little bit about the coffee issue from your part of the world. You're coming to us from Nicaragua. Central America is a huge coffee growing region in the world. So I would love to hear a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that coffee farmers in your region are currently facing.
Thank you. Yeah, in the case of Christianity in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, Christianity is working with small-scale producers and their cooperatives, and in order to provide the access or allow the access to climate information, in order to contribute to the capacity to make resilience building decisions. In that case, we have worked with some cooperative and partners here in Nicaragua, and we have developed with them an agrometeorological information system to provide climate monitoring, but also crop monitoring. It means that the small farmers are involved in collecting information, climatic information, but also receiving the analysis of this information and also about the phenotype monitoring of the crops that they are using in these in their farms. And the other part, we have supported also the climate modeling. Our partner Central Humboldt in Nicaragua have developed a system based on PRESIS, the regional climate modeling software, and applied to various crops, and not only coffee but also beans and rice, to analyze what is the longer term viability of these crops in the region, and how the small farmers can adapt and can make the decision and can make the right investment, looking at the longer term situation for these crops.
And Moises, what would you say, are some of the challenges for farmers having access to that knowledge? A lot of my travel, usually when we're not in pandemic times, is to Central America. So I've seen, coffee farms in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, as well as in Colombia. And, you have people that are really passionate about what they do, and a lot of different types of programs that are, trying to help get people access to things that can help grow their crops in a changing environment, whether that's increased or decreased rain patterns, process and growth of pests, which obviously is a huge issue as well. So what are some of the specific things that farmers you are finding are facing, and, do they typically know what to do, and how is Christian Aid sort of working to help get them what they need to be successful?
Okay. Yes. No, I think that the main problems that the small farmers are facing related to the coffee production is about how to manage the system in trying to move from the monoculture system to a more diversified system in the farm, because they cannot depend only on the coffee production. How to introduce other crops that are able to provide sustainability to the farm and the families. And for us, it's really important that the small farmers have the opportunity to access the right information to make decisions. It means to, I think it is really important how the investment are oriented to provide the right technology, but also the technical advisory to the small farmer, and try to analyze how the changes in the climate are affecting the crops, and what is the correct decision that they need to take in order to ensure the sustainability of the families, the crops, but also the coffee production in that case, because in many cases is the main economic activity. But also for us it's really important, and for the small farmer, and because their knowledge, they know that it is really important to have a very diversified system to deal with the climate situation, the climate variation, and how the change in the temperature, for example, is affecting the coffee and the coffee production and the productivity. And in case of small producers working in areas below the 1,000 meters, maybe they need to diversify with cocoa. It's the opportunity that we have worked with these small farmers, introducing new crops able to be adapted to the new condition in the climate in the area. And in that case, the introduction of cocoa production has been an opportunity, but it has been based in climatic information and climate analysis between different organizations, and the inclusion and the dialogue with the small scale farmers in the area, in the region.
I think that point that you make, Moises, is so important about, how everything is connected, and how we really have to think about this biodiverse ecosystem. And it's, of course, not just a coffee crop. We can make coffee thrive more if we actually also introduce additional crops, and they can all sort of work together to make the whole system more sustainable. And you mentioned two things that I want to pick up on. David, I want to come to you on the technology piece and talk a little bit about, the importance of getting smallholder coffee farmers the appropriate technology that, is allowing them to adapt to these sustainable practices as well as have that market access.
Yeah, there's been some really exciting changes in technology on a number of different fronts over the past 10 or 15 years, some of which I've been involved in. There were opportunities about 10 or 15 years ago, there were opportunities to, in new processing technologies, which were dramatically less capital intensive. And so historically, there were many smallholder farmers who were missing out on the entire value of their crop because they just weren't able to process the coffee in a way which maximized the value. But new technologies emerged which enabled mills that could be constructed with far less cost, far less footprint. You could literally unbolt a mill and put it in a shed at the end of the season. And this allowed 30 to 40% increases in premiums for farmers who were in high altitude areas. So that was a really interesting technology that came along. We helped create a system over the years where vetiver grass could be used, which is a new way of ensuring that wastewater management was done more effectively. So rather than having a lot of the processing pulp end up in rivers and then having derogatory effects for livestock and for people, there were new technologies which enabled very cost efficiently but far more environmentally friendly to enable the pulp to get captured by the vetiver grass. The vetiver grass then converted that pollution into biomass, and the rivers were cleaner. More recently, with the emergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence, there were tremendous opportunities we saw, which led to the creation of Veritas. That processes could be done far more cost efficiently than they'd been done historically in the past. Farmers, in many cases, smallholder farmers actually are conducting their coffee sustainably. There just hasn't been an effective way to measure that because there are 12.5 million coffee farms in the world. It's very fragmented. They might have a very small income, maybe $150, $200, but a sustainability audit might cost $3,000. So there wasn't just really a way for them to be able to validate to the world that they're sustainable. Some of these technologies, such as machine learning, have enabled us to dramatically collapse the cost so that these farmers could participate. And then finally, I think in the realm closer to home with the conversation around climate in Kyoto, or the COP26, there's a lot of attention now on carbon and net zero, and how do we validate that deforestation isn't occurring in supply chains, which is one of the potentially large contributors to carbon in supply chains. And with machine learning, we've been able to dramatically improve the effectiveness and lower the cost of being able to do deforestation detection. So we effectively now can use satellite imagery to monitor that in a way that wasn't possible even 4 years ago in an accurate way.
And why is that monitoring so important? What do you hope to achieve by being able to give farmers that information and say, my carbon footprint of my entire operation here is X, and therefore I'm contributing in this way, or I know I need to change my practices in that way? Why do farmers specifically need that type of information?
I guess for two reasons. One is their customers are increasingly making commitments to the global community on this front. So the large coffee companies of the world are making commitments around what is the carbon in their supply chain and what their plans are to do that. So if you want to participate and sell coffee to a company who is making those sort of commitments, then you need to be somehow involved in a way where this can be measured and an improvement can be made over time. So that would be sort of one important reason why this becomes important to farmers. But secondly, there are some really exciting possibilities emerging around to what degree carbon can get trapped in soil and soil organic carbon. Still fairly early days in being able to measure this at scale and be able to see what sort of changes in farm practices can occur. But there certainly are opportunities for win-win where farmers are able to utilize more sustainable practices. That leads to a better ability for the soil to be in a healthier state, more able to withstand weather's heavier than average rainfall, pest and disease, better is able to trap more carbon in the soil, and then you get this virtuous cycle where their soils are better. Companies are looking for that sort of coffee for the promises they're making to regulators and customers. So that sort of virtuous cycle win-win is sort of some of the exciting opportunities that are coming out of this carbon debate.
And I think it's going to be really interesting to see sort of where that trend goes now, because I do think a huge piece of this sustainability conversation is driven by the consumer that you brought up, right? People have sort of an ever increasing desire to know where the things that they're consuming that they use in their everyday lives are coming from, and what sort of environmental impact the production and transport and all of that across the whole value chain, the whole food system actually has, and basing their purchasing decisions off of that, and saying oh, I want to support a coffee company that is sourcing their beans from farmers who are using sustainable practices and all of that. So I think we're gonna keep seeing that growing, and we've got world leaders meeting at COP, and various conversations here in the US about what's really going to drive the climate change actions that we need to be taking to actually achieve the goals. Is it something that governments should and can be mandating, or is it something that needs to be market driven? And that's certainly a conversation that we're having politically here in the US at the moment. But really is going to make a difference how much consumers I think are demanding this, and obviously with a product like coffee that is again a part of so many people's lives. Anmol, I want to come back to you on the second piece that Moises had raised on financing, and talk a little bit about how Winrock is thinking about sustainable financing, not only with coffee but across other agricultural value chains, and how you're working to help direct particular investments to developing a more sustainable value chain.
Sure, absolutely. And as much as I'm a finance guy and this question is about finance, the fact of the matter is finance is only a means to an end, right? So a lot of the work in finance actually begins with the people who will be absorbing the finance, which if you take a value chain approach could be up and down the value chain, starting with the farmers all the way to the buyers or the end user of the product. So we do take a value chain approach to understanding where finance is most needed and most effective. A trap that we really try to avoid is to generate pools of capital for the sake of generating pools of capital. So in our estimation, it is most effective when you target the part of the value chain that is most adept at absorbing and deploying finance. So to give you an example, in the work that we are doing in Indonesia, it is clear to us that capital is needed at the farm level. But based on some of the work that actually Enveritas has shared with us, your team that works in that region, we also know that the farmers over there are indebted, and the last thing they need is to take on more loans. They are farmers, they don't get excited about loans. Bankers get excited about loans. So how do we then create a mechanism in which an intermediary in the value chain is the one that gets the financing and is able to create alternative repayment methods for the farmers to be able to borrow and then as part of their normal input output cycle, absorb that additional capital. So that's generally our approach to finance. And so that's on sort of how we create the financing mechanism. But we also know that in order to put that together, we need to work with different financial sector actors. So on one hand, we work with local banks as the actual holder of capital that is then lent to the intermediary. But then we also work with donors that provide technical assistance capital or grant funding to strengthen the capacity of the value chain. And we also work with the philanthropic sector, impact investors, to create the right sort of de-risking mechanism so that the local banks are actually able to engage in a way that they hitherto aren't able to. So it's I think I learned a term yesterday in a net zero discussion called radical collaboration, and that's certainly the approach that we use.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're hearing from donors. I mean, where are donors at on this sustainability piece? As we were talking about a little bit earlier, the market has definitely been shifting more and more in this direction. And, are you consistently getting interest from donors in directing investments, directing funding and financing towards making the value chain more sustainable? Do you feel like that's at the top of people's lists at the moment?
Increasingly so. I would say as an international development organization, that is our bread and butter, right? We work with donors in areas of programming that are of interest to them. And consistently for many donors, agriculture and food security has been a core issue. The change we've seen over the past 4 years is the demand for including private sector actors up and down your different areas of programming, whether it's as non-capital intensive as capacity building to the more capital intensive interventions like creating access to finance. And I think that's because of two reasons. First of all, donors and governments know they can't do it alone, right? Second of all, the private sector is where the real capital actually lies. So if we really want to make long-term transformation, we have to create pathways in which the private sector can be involved. So I think while the amount of attention that donors pay to this sector hasn't changed, what has changed is their mandate that we are supposed to comply with, which is to ensure that we bring the private sector along across all these activities and interventions.
Yeah, definitely. I think as you said, the role of the private sector is, always going to be front and center of this, and they can drive the conversation, but it is about creating those incentives, right? Of let's bring you along and make this the best way to be operating and ensure that the financing is going to the right places. We've got just about 5 minutes left. I want to come back to each of you one time with the same question. And we have leaders meeting at COP. What is the message that you would deliver to them, from your part of the world, from your piece of, this development landscape when it comes to sustainability? What's something that you really want them to have in mind as they're having their conversations? Moises, we'll come to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no, I think it's really important that we remember that the 70% of the world's coffee is on small scale producers and their cooperative. Is this sector? This sector has a very important role in the coffee production. The second, I think that in terms of the sustainability, it is important that to build resilience for coffee means adopting also agroecological methods, trying to change the mentality about the system that we are promoting through the coffee. In that case, we need to talk about systems which are really diversified and are able to incorporate different elements in the production system in the farm. And the other point I think is important, you mentioned before, is about the low prices that the small farmer receive for the high quality product they grow, and how to change this way of distribute the richness. And also important because if the small farmer receive enough and fair price, they could invest in a better system in the farm. They can be more resilient, and then we are going to have coffee. If not, the coffee disappears.
Exactly. I think that's a pretty important call to action. We can't have the coffee disappear. The rest of the world will stop functioning. David, let's come to you on this question.
Yeah, I think my message would be for those in COP26 to just be persistent. This is a difficult process. It's easy to get impatient with the process. Democracy is messy, but international diplomacy and trying to bring together multiple nations even more messy. There are many different voices. There are many different constituents. It isn't as easy as simply asking all governments to charge forth with an agenda that isn't necessarily that they don't have their own citizens aligned with. And we can see that just in the US with the sort of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back that has occurred from Kyoto to Paris to now. So point 1, I think, would be just to recognize that this is it needs persistence, it needs stamina, it needs resilience, but just sort of to keep at it and not to get distracted by the noise, not to get distracted by by so many things that could get in the way of a very monumental, really multi-decade effort that has to take place. And secondly, to certainly look at how the public sector and the private sector can help advance agendas in their own ways. They're very different. They have very different strengths and weaknesses. But one of the great opportunities in the private sector is the private sector can move much faster. It doesn't have the same sort of decision-making processes that require an enormous amount of consensus building. Rather, companies are able to, with a much smaller set of decision makers, decide that this is the strategy, this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to go forward in. And by doing that, I think particularly multinational companies can really set a great example, because they can play a catalytic role where they can demonstrate this is possible, and doing that in a very rigorous way, which sort of setting a vision, that's simply not enough. Then actually having to build the plan that will actually map that vision, and then that's not enough. And then actually executing that plan. But in doing that, and in their own microcosm, I think that what the world is looking for and needing is these inspirational examples of success. And so in their way, they can then set an example that gives that sort of sustenance to the broader international efforts that we'll need if we're going to make progress on this issue.
Yeah, definitely. Keeping the eye on the prize here. I think, like you said, there's so much noise. All right, to close it out, Anmol, we'll come back to you on this question.
Right. I think my plea to the participants of COP26, especially the decision makers, is to focus on adaptation. We have unfortunately altered the Earth's geophysical conditions, and as much as I hope we can stop it from going beyond a certain threshold, we still have to deal with the impact. So my plea would be to focus on adaptation and actually help make the leapfrog that we need. Right now, climate adaptation finance is only 5% of global climate finance, and we need to grow from 30 billion a year to 300 billion a year in less than 10 years. But I think we can do it, and we can learn from some of the successes we did on the mitigation side. We need the right combination of technology solutions, capacity building, incentives, and finance. And when we package that together in collaboration with the private sector, the donor sector, and governments, I think that leapfrog is possible. But on one hand, my plea is to not reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, it is to be creative on how you leverage what we've already done before.
Excellent. I think that's a great sort of hopeful call to action that we can end on, that, you think this is possible if everyone does what we all know that we all need to be doing. Like you said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. I think the way forward is obvious. It's just a matter of doing it. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us. We really appreciate having you with us today. I'm going to put in a quick plug at the end here for Devex's Food Systems newsletter, where we are exploring the intersection of all of these issues, sustainability, biodiversity, coffee, and what that means for all of us here. And you can find our newsletter, Devex Dish, if you just Google that. And I think we'll also have a link in the chat for you. We would love to have you join our community and subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you again for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, for this conversation brought to you in partnership with DAI. I am here with Walter Kertejari, who is coming to us from Peru. He is the president of ECA Amacaeri. And thank you so much, Walter, for being with us today. It is great to see you. We are going to be talking a little bit about locally led solutions when it comes to the issue of biodiversity loss. Walter, tell us a little bit about the place where you live, the work that you do, and how you're experiencing biodiversity loss in your everyday life.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Teresa, for this important space today. My name is Walter Kertejari. I belong to the Harakbat community. It's an indigenous community from the Madre de Dios region. We manage a protected natural area under the category of a communal reserve. the Amarakeri Reserve is made up of more than 400,000 hectares of land. It's inhabited by 10 native communities, and there are 2 indigenous organizations. We're located in the Madre de Dios department in Peru, and our activities involve the implementation of area management tools. These are the so-called Plan Maestro, master plan, the institutional life or development plan, and conservation agreements. We're basically in charge of the general administration of the reserve, the protection of important rivers, the sources of which are located inside the reserve itself, and at the same time we work to create opportunities for our member communities to develop and to live full lives.
Thanks, Walter. And tell us a little bit more about how you are observing your work changing as you're managing this reserve. Are there things that you're seeing in your community that maybe you weren't experiencing, 20, 30 years ago, where you're seeing some really stark impacts from climate change where you live?
Mira, respecto al cambio climático.
Well, in terms of climate change, I think that the whole world is witnessing changes in weather and temperature. This is basically due to industry, which is something that we don't even really have in Peru. I believe that indigenous communities have also been feeling the effects of climate change, which is a global problem. In our communities specifically, we've been noticing changes in the weather. Sometimes there's more rain than usual. There are also more cold periods than there used to be in the rainforest. For instance, there used to be just 2 or even 1 frosts, cold snaps really, or a friaje in Spanish, in the Amazon, but nowadays this happens much more often. There's been a reduction in agricultural output, in resources for daily consumption are also diminishing because there's not even enough rain to keep a small farm going. It's also having an effect on the disappearance or the low production levels of certain flora and fauna. The fauna in particular is a key source of food, not just for indigenous people, but for the entire country. We're also noticing the reduction in water resources, in water itself. We worry, in fact, that in the future we will end up fighting over water. In our communities, we're developing some activities to do with fish farming in the Amazon River. But the problem right now is that these diminishing water resources are also having a negative effect on this fish farming. So all of these things then have to do with what we call climate change, which is already having an impact even on indigenous people. We're very worried about these consequences. It's not just about there not being water. I think it's a quite general problem for indigenous people, and that's why we must continue to protect our forests, because our survival depends on it.
Gracias.
Walter, I
Thank
love
you.
that you brought up the way that climate change looks for you and your reality, and where you live, it's actually a cooling of the climate and you're seeing additional frosts. I think we sometimes have this concept of global warming and that it always means hotter and hotter, but that's not necessarily the effect it's having everywhere. And in the Amazon, the effect of climate change is so stark. You mentioned the water issue, which obviously is huge, not only in your community, but all over the world and connected to so many other issues of biodiversity. If there's no water, then so many different crops, flora, fauna, as you were saying, can't thrive. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you think needs to be done to solve some of these problems. You're obviously seeing these acute demonstrations of climate change in your community. What both can your community and the broader global community be doing to reverse these effects?
Mira, hay varios temas.
Well, there are lots of issues that can be addressed. Indigenous people have already started working on these issues, and we're looking to nature for solutions. We must protect our rivers and our forests. Maintaining a forest is much more worthwhile than chopping it down. This is something that our communities have come to understand over the years. So what must be done? Well, we must promote sustainable economic activities that are in tune with the forests. This will help us to maintain them, which in turn will help to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. So with this in mind, our approach among Indigenous people is based on holistic management, comprehensive management of our forests, in line with our values and our worldview. Our proposal now has a climate goal, and it's called the Amazonian Indigenous Network. One of the main pillars of this approach is legal protection of territories. Another is the recognition and the valuing of ancestral knowledge. It's also about financial sustainability, reporting, monitoring, surveillance of indigenous lands, of protected natural areas. And above all, it's about building the indigenous economy in communities to continue to foster what these communities have already begun. For example, we've designed a program of sustainable economic activities based on leveraging tourism, based on reforestation, agroforestry, and fish farming. Fish farming not just for commercial purposes, but also thinking about food security. Mining activities have polluted our rivers. We must continue to strengthen these aquaculture activities, this fish farming in our communities. There's the ongoing support for a native cocoa production chain and for Brazil nuts. Also, the communities continue to create social enterprise. We are creating one social enterprise right now, which will be the commercial arm of our organization. And we're also making sure that communities receive a fair wage for their work. With all of these processes, it's important to continue with regular special patrols in Indigenous lands to ensure that forests continue to be maintained. For this, international cooperation is also key. To allocate direct funds to Indigenous communities as part of the fight against deforestation and against degradation, and specifically against the problem of climate change, which is a global problem not only affecting Indigenous communities.
Sí, cambio.
Walter, I think that's a great call to action to end on. You're so right. Of course, this isn't a problem that only affects Indigenous people, it affects us all. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to share your message. We really appreciate it.
Sí, estamos en ese proceso nosotros.
Yes, we are in this process now. We're continuing to work towards the climate goals of the Amazonian Indigenous Network. We've already been working on activities to do with adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and we always carry our message to Indigenous people. We've moved from a protest to proposals and from proposals to action. Why? Well, because we've been working with the forest, because our people have become more aware. They've become more aware of the problems that we face and the fact that maintaining our forests can bring us many benefits. This is why our comprehensive management approach for our forests is so important, the Amazonian Indigenous Network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter, for being here with us today. It was great speaking with you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you might be joining us from. My name is Tanya Karas. I'm a senior editor at Devex, and welcome to Devex at COP26. In the lead up to this momentous event, there have been several reports on the rise of climate change already and what we're going to see in the coming decades. The rise of climate displacement comes with it. This is particularly true in lower income countries that tend to be the most climate vulnerable and often the least equipped to respond to these changing migration patterns. I'm joined here by a group of excellent panelists who are all experts in the area of displacement and climate change. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Dr. Kanta Kumari Rigo. She is the lead environment specialist and a regional climate change coordinator of the Africa region at the World Bank. Kanta, you were behind two pretty momentous reports recently called the Groundswell reports, one in 2018 and one this year, an updated version that focused on internal migration. Your report this year warned that unchecked climate change could lead to 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. And of course, that's just internal migration. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why this focus on internal migration and whether that's really going to be what the world should be the most prepared to see in the coming years and decades.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here. And that's a great question. Why did we focus on internal climate migration? We know that migration, happens across the borders, it happens regionally, and it certainly happens within countries. Our focus on internal climate migration was driven by the data out there that says 3 out of 4 people actually move within their own countries. And that's not to say that other movement is not important, but we wanted to focus on this with a view to really understanding what are really the drivers of migration at the local level. We know that a lot of this movement starts somewhere and at the localities that it does. So this really, brought us to looking at the issues at the nexus of where climate, migration, and development come together at the local level. So using the 2 reports, the Groundswell Acting for Internal Climate Migration, which we launched recently, as well as Groundswell Preparing for Internal Migration 3 years ago. Through the 2 reports, we were really able to reaffirm the potency for climate to drive the movement within countries. Particularly, we focus on the slow onsets, which is looking at water stress, drops in crop productivity, and sea level rise, compounded by storm surge, which can really oftentimes undermine the habitability of those areas. And that global number that you referred to, the 216 million, comes out of a focus of the 6 World Bank regions. In the first report, we looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. In the sequel report, we looked at East Asia, we looked at Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and we looked at North Africa. We also did look at other regions qualitatively, which is the Mashrek region and the small island developing states.
Thank you so much. And we'll definitely come back to this report later in the conversation too. Next, I'd like to turn to Kaylee Ober. She is a senior advocate and program manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. Kaylee, we just heard from Kanta about internal migration. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about cross-border displacement as well, because of course we're going to see a huge rise in that too. And so could you tell us a little bit about the current legal framework for that, and really like a lack of a good legal framework for how to deal with cross-border migrants who are being displaced because of climate change?
Sure. First, I'd like to say that I agree with Kanta's assessment that most of the movement we'll see in the face of climate change will be internal in nature. Although, crossing over borders brings with it different additional challenges. And that's why this conversation about cross-border protection is so important. There's one way of looking at cross-border protection, and that's international protection, or the 1951 Refugee Convention, which I think you're referring to, and which most people at home and those in the media care most about, because it's a strong international framework and it's binding, and many states have signed on to it, including the United States. The reason why the term climate refugee is not applicable or is not useful in the context of this convention is for a very simple reason. The Refugee Convention lays out very specifically and defines who a refugee is, and nowhere in it does it talk about climate change or environmental change. And with climate change, it adds additional layers of difficulty in understanding attribution, like to what degree does climate change really induce such movements? Aside from the legal question, which is where does climate change feature in the convention? Fortunately, there's brilliant legal minds thinking about this, including the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, who released in October, in fact, a new legal considerations paper that really takes into account the context of climate change and disaster within the Refugee Convention and regional refugee definitions, such as the Cartagena Declaration or the OAU Convention. And it finds that in certain cases, the convention may be applicable to folks who are displaced in the context of climate change. For instance, if you suffer from a climate disaster and your government purposely does not provide relief and recovery for you because of your status within a social group, that may mean that you've been persecuted, or it's tantamount to persecution. And so therefore, that international protection can be possibly extended to you. Likewise, these regional refugee definitions are much more expansive than the 1951 Refugee Convention. So in the Cartagena Declaration and the OAU Convention, they really talk about disturbance of public order, which is a much broader aspect that people are starting to believe can cover climate change and displacement issues. So those are things that are really on the forefront that we're interested in diving into a little bit deeper.
Yeah, definitely. That's fascinating. And I'm sure that, these are areas of international law that will only become more and more important with the rise of, more climate displacement. So of course, I have many, many more questions for you as well, but let's get to our last panelist too, Zeke Simbringham. He's the Global Lead of Migration and Displacement for the IFRC. Zeke, you work a lot in conflict and disaster settings. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how IFRC's work is shifting and changing as more and more people are displaced for climate reasons.
Thanks, Tanya, and of course, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I think for us, the first thing to recognize is that this is a critical humanitarian issue. It's creating devastating impacts on individuals, on communities across the world, but it's also a very diverse humanitarian issue. There is no one type of climate-related displacement. There is no one type of climate displaced person. So for us, a lot of our work is focused on action, but also enhancing our understanding of this issue. And so we have recently released a new global report that looks at what are the impacts of climate-related displacement on communities across the world today. And it looks at 11 different contexts, and they are deliberately diverse contexts where communities are already facing the humanitarian impacts of climate-related displacement. We have examples of, as you have mentioned, internal displacement, but also cross-border displacement. And for example, one of the contexts we look at is the humanitarian needs of communities who fled drought in Angola and they crossed the border into Namibia. We also look at the impact on communities who fled climate-related impacts and then joined migration caravans in the Central Americas. But we also, of course, look at a lot of contexts where people are displaced within their own countries by a diverse range of hazards and climate features, from sea level rise to storms to floods to landslides. Another thing that we are looking at in terms of better understanding how we can support communities is where these impacts are compounding or concurrent, where we see storms hitting the same communities within the space of a few weeks or even months, and where we see compound impacts, not only from the COVID-19 pandemic and its related impacts on communities and how that intersects with climate, but also, as you mentioned, where we see communities affected by conflict who are now also being impacted by climate-related impacts. So we see a lot of critical humanitarian needs, but we also see a lot of diversity. And so as there is no one type of climate displaced person, there is no one type of solutions. So some of the things we really are focusing on is community-led solutions, Tanya. We really need to better understand what are the impacts at the community level, what are the solutions that communities themselves can bring to this issue, and how can we as a global humanitarian network take that to scale across the world?
That sounds like a really fascinating report. And yeah, solutions seems like a very tricky thing to find in this context, certainly. I'd love to talk about solutions with all of you, actually. Perhaps we could start with Kanta. What do you think are some of the, from the Groundswell report, can you tell us some of your recommendations for governments? Yeah, I'd like to know if some of the recommendations that you had for governments and what obligations they have for their own citizens who might be internally displaced.
Indeed, I think the problems are plentiful, and I think the reality is, as you know, Tanya, in the 6th IPCC Science Assessment Report, the forecast or the future is even more daunting, right? So I think the reality is that we must now begin to prepare for this with even greater escalation of efforts. So in the Groundswell report, we really underscore 3 key policy issues. The first is, I think, and critically important, we must cut down greenhouse gas emissions. Without that, I think the kind of impacts that we are looking at will multiply and will escalate, whether it's impacts on crop productivity, whether it's the sea level rise, or whether it's the kind of water stress or the uncertainty of when the seasonality patterns shifting. So it's really important that we cut down the greenhouse gases. And in the Groundswell report, what we did was a scenario-based analysis that also allowed us to look at a plausible scenario where, if we did a few things right, we could really reduce the scale of climate-induced migration. So the first is, as I said, cut down the greenhouse gases. The second is, how do we really bring and embed migration into the context of development planning? And I speak especially from the context of a development institution. And there are things that we can begin to do and are doing, but we need to all step up on that. And that is really recognizing that we need to better help communities, to the point that Ziki was making, adapt in place, right? Better adapt in place, whether it's coming up with crops that are drought resilient or whether we have the water availability, taken care of. but also looking at diversification of economic opportunities and livelihoods. So adapting in place is really important. But there will come a time when there are situations where one has to move. And in that context, how do you facilitate that movement in a way that is safe and dignified, in line with the kind of conventions and legal provisions that exist, and also those within the country? So that becomes really important. And the third is, after communities have had to move, what is it that we can do to make sure there's greater social cohesion between the hosts and the migrants? And as I speak, Tanya, I mean, this could be sort of things we're doing now. But one of the things about the Groundswell report is that we really call for looking at things across the time horizon. We found in the report, beyond the number that is big or small, one can argue about it, is the spatial dimension, because locality really matters. What we find is that between now and as early as 2030, you could see the emergence of climate migration hotspots. These are hotspots where people could move into because they're relatively more attractive, or move out from. And it is that movement that one needs to sort of look and plan towards, because what you want is, where movement needs to happen, it should happen. But in other cases, how do we bring in the best kind of development options to make sure that, or even humanitarian, to make sure that that movement happens in a safe and dignified way and in a productive way? So there are lots of solutions out there, lots of projects that we can come back and talk about, which are beginning to do this, but it's about doing it at scale that I think is really what we need to push for.
Definitely. That's really fascinating, Kanta. Thank you for sharing that. And you talked about really preparing, and I think that is maybe something that is just dawning on a lot of governments, especially this year. Well, with the pandemic too, and especially this year with the rise of so many natural disasters, just really this like need and realization, this slow realization that all of you folks on this call have been talking about for years and years and years, but is really just becoming, a lot more mainstream, and hopefully we'll see some action from that. Was there anyone else who wanted to talk about solutions that that you have been studying in regard to the rise of climate-induced displacement?
I'm happy to jump in there, Tanya, if that's okay, and very much complement a lot of what Kanta has mentioned, and also picking up on your point around preparedness. A lot of what we do as a humanitarian network, a lot of what we do as the Red Cross and Red Crescent is humanitarian response. And I had a look today, and Tanya, we have an active 91 emergency humanitarian response operations across the globe today. The vast majority of them are connected to weather and climate-related hazards, and the majority of them have people, individuals, communities who have been displaced by the effects of those hazards. So that's a very visible part of what we do as humanitarians. But picking up on what Kanta has said, and also your point about preparedness, when we look at climate-related displacement, a very critical opportunity we have is that we don't have to wait until people are displaced. We can, and we should, and we must act now. Again, going back to my original point, recognizing the diversity of this issue, that's going to look very different in different contexts. That adaptation, that resilience is going to be distinct across the globe. So we need to recognize the local reality. We need to recognize the complexity of what that looks like. We also, as you mentioned at the start, Tanya, need to recognize that it's the most vulnerable, the people who are already marginalized, who are the most at risk from the humanitarian impacts of climate-related displacement. But we need to see these communities, we need to work with these communities not only as at risk and potentially vulnerable, but also having important capacities, and the communities themselves having important solutions and ways of adapting and ideas and knowledge that we need to harness as a globe, rather than seeing communities as passive victims in this issue.
Definitely. Yeah. And of course, the more that we can get people involved, I think people often know what is best for them. And so if they are given a voice and given real power to be part of that change, that will hopefully lead to more sustainable solutions for this growing problem. So definitely hope we see some more of that. Kaylee, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, there was a really interesting report that Refugees International had earlier this summer, where you basically said that it was mostly about the United States. And the report said that the US has a special responsibility to lead on issues of climate change, migration, and displacement. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, both the United States in particular, but similar obligations that perhaps other richer countries have, and what should that special responsibility look like?
Thank you so much. So that report was called, was put together by a task force of experts, former government officials from the State Department and USAID, technical experts on the issue of climate change, migration, displacement, and heads of major NGOs. And so it was really a collaborative effort to point out ways in which the Biden administration in particular could grapple with this issue in response to actually the Biden administration issuing an executive order in February 2021 requesting that the SC put together a report on this very issue. And so, I think we make the case very clearly that the United States is a key player in this for many reasons. One, the US has absolutely a moral obligation to be interested and engaged with climate change and migration issues as the largest greenhouse gas emitter historically. I think in addition, it just has a practical, logical responsibility as well as a country that has traditionally been the biggest donor towards humanitarian efforts, as well as towards resettling a very high number of refugees historically in the past. So I think there is many reasons why the US should be involved, but the Biden administration has also signaled it wants to be involved and become a leader on this issue. And in fact, just the other week, released this NSC report that I've referenced, in which it enumerates a number of ways that it could work on issues related to foreign assistance, international security, multilateral engagement, and protection and resettlement in regards to climate change and migration issues. Unfortunately, the report didn't go into great detail about policy. And so we're looking forward to this newly created interagency working group that's supposed to be a follow-up to this report to really delve into that detail there. And I think it's hugely important the Biden administration continues to lead on this.
Definitely. And as you were talking, I was thinking about something that Kanta said earlier about development planning. And so I wondered if anyone wants to jump in here on what can that planning really look like? Like, how do we get different stakeholders involved to really plan for this reality, whether it's within borders and across borders?
I'd like to come back to that, Tanya. I think it's a very important and pertinent conversation to have. And, following the Groundswell report, we put out the Groundswell Africa reports. And these reports, looking at both West Africa and the Lake Victoria Basin, really have taken a more sort of granular analysis of how this climate-induced migration could play out within the context of those countries. So it uses an expanded model and just more granular analysis. But more than that, I think it provides, I believe, policymakers a basis for good dialogue and action. And your question about what does action really mean? And I think what we first of all want to underscore, I think, is that migration is not always a negative. It is an adaptation strategy, right? And it reminds me a little bit about the pastoralists in the Sahel. I see them as the sort of original climate adapters. They'd always moved, with the changing seasonality, with their livestock, looking for pastures and water that was more predictable. The dilemma now is how climate has thrown in, the uncertainty and the unreliability. And so even as they move, they are not able to find those resources. And then there's an increasing number of conflict with the sedentary farmers. And so we therefore have, like Kaylee was saying, the moral obligation to support this community. So the question is how? And, in the Groundswell Africa, we begin to sort of pull together what we call a migration and climate informed solutions framework. And this framework combines the need to act now, but also brings in the development planning. It has really five critical dimensions. The first is, I think we continue to need to understand the issue better. It is unfolding, and we know that migration is multifaceted, and there are multiple reasons why people move, social, environmental, political sometimes, but clearly now climate being the amplifying factor. But understanding that both in the current and historical context is important. But the second part of it is, while we can look at the situation in very small locales, which is important to support the communities, we also need to take a bigger picture vision of it. Because as I mentioned, that climate is acting across the landscapes, across the countries, and of course, even internationally, but talking about within the country, it's acting. And so as you see this mobility driven by climate factors from one locale to another, it's important to take a territorial and a bigger landscape approach so that you are able to manage the situation from climate in and out migration perspectives. But importantly, you can draw that into part of your economic and demographic transitions. In sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at the 30-year horizon, you have a population that's going to be doubling in this 30 years from 2020 to 2050. And that demographic itself, which is now 60 to 70% reliant on climate sensitive livelihoods, needs a transition driven by economic transition, driven by jobs that are more climate sensitive or climate smart. And that needs to happen at a planning level, building the right kind of human capital almost to make sure that in the case of Africa, where I work a lot on, making sure we get these young people trained and able to transit into that new economy. But the fourth dimension that we look at is really calling on ourselves, the development community, the humanitarian community, and the security community coming together and working to the points that Ziki is making that are really important, so that we don't act in silos, but we act in an end-to-end fashion. And the last part of that framework is about the legal side that Kingsley's been talking about. How do we bridge that legal provisions in the country? Many countries have signed on to some of these global processes and global frameworks, like the Global Framework for Climate Migration, but Global Compact for Climate Migration. But how do we domesticate them? In the Africa context, we have the Kampala Convention, which has been signed on again, but domesticating what that means at a national level. So we think that the planning within and across these 5 pillars really provides a way to think through the issues, plan for today, act for today, plan for tomorrow, and as part of the sort of taking the countries into that sustainable development pathways that are climate smart and climate resilient. Just thought I'll share that with you because I think it's a pragmatic way, and it's not new. It's really pulling together threads that have existed, but providing countries and governments a way to act on it systematically.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really helpful framework for thinking about what needs to be done. And I wondered, this could be a question for anyone on the call. Are there any examples, either at the country or regional level, that you think are really working in terms of how to think about climate migration and how to really prepare for it? Are there any initiatives that we can point to as inspiration?
Yeah, Tanya, in fact, the regional level is really leading the way in solutions, especially around cross-border migration. So we see in different parts of the world, in different regions and subregions, this move towards freedom of movement. So we know that, like Kanta said, we can try to prevent migration as much as possible, either through interventions around climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, things of that nature. But people still need to move. And in fact, it's an adaptation strategy. So how do we facilitate that movement or ensure that that movement is safe and dignified, as Kanta said earlier? And I think it's important, the freedom of mobility across borders, the ability to seek out shelter and safety across the border in certain situations is quite important. So you have something like the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, EGOT, which is a sub-region of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of East and the Great Lakes and Southern Africa, which have put together this freedom of movement protocol that allows people in the face of disaster to cross borders legally and to seek out safety and shelter across borders within that region. And I think that is really the forefront. That's really the future of climate change related migration, especially across borders, to allow people to move freely.
Zeke, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think picking up on that point, but also Kant's point before, when we look at the development perspective, when we look at the longer term perspective, we see that people, as Kylie and Kant have mentioned a lot, is people move in a lot of different ways. And there's one aspect that we haven't spoken about, one very specific way in which communities are moving, and that is when they take the decision that the impacts of climate are such a great risk that they need to permanently leave their community as a community. We call this planned relocation. It's where a community decides that they need to move. That's the best and the safest way to adapt to the impacts of climate. This is a very specific type of movement. It's a complicated type of way in which a community would move. And I think picking up on the point before about timescale, there's two aspects that we really need to look at. One is that this is not just a shelter project. This is not just creating new houses and new shelters in a new location away from where a community is. This is really a community building project. This is really a community development project. And so in terms of the time scale, we really need supporting actors. We really need the community themselves to look at a long-term horizon on this. And we have examples of communities that have moved, and 10 years later, local Red Cross and Red Crescent societies have gone to check how is the community development process going, far beyond the construction of shelter, far beyond the construction of facilities. So I think that's a very particular type of movement that we're seeing connected to climate. It is complicated, but it's also something that we're seeing come up as an operational a reality for many communities. And on that particular aspect, Tanya, as well, we see some good practices. We see legal and policy and regulatory frameworks being developed, particularly in the Pacific, connected to sea level rise, where communities are looking at the realities of the climate crisis and saying the best possible thing we can do is to leave where we're living as a community permanently.
Yeah, certainly that's a very drastic solution. And, you know, many other solutions involve allowing people to stay in place. But of course, that will require a lot of what we're hoping to see out of out of COP, which is multilateral cooperation that will reduce the effects of climate change going forward. That's actually all we have time for on this really fascinating and very complicated topic. I feel like there's so much more we could have gone into, but thank you so much to our expert panelists, and thank you so much to our audience. Remember, if you would like to learn more from Devex, you can follow us on Twitter, and of course, subscribe to our newsletters, Devex Newswire being the flagship daily newsletter. And thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Devex at COP26 interview on the humanitarian impact of the climate crisis. We're very lucky to be joined by Francesco Rocca, President of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. My name is Will Worley. I'm the UK correspondent at Devex, and I also contribute reporting on COP26. I also contribute to the Newswire, Devex's daily newsletter for the global development sector, and there should be a link popping up on your screens roundabout now. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, President Rocca. Really appreciate it. So my first question to you. So the international humanitarian situation is already pretty bleak. There's multiple humanitarian crises bubbling up all over the place. What do you think are the key risks of a warming climate on the humanitarian sector? And can you specify single out a key risk that you're most concerned about?
Thank you, Will. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, of course. For us as humanitarian, we are very concerned. Climate change has created real and unprecedented humanitarian needs. We, as a federation, we released a report just a few weeks ago, and looking at that figure since the beginning of COVID-19, the numbers are really scary, because we had more than 433 extreme events. We lost more than 17,000 lives, and more than 139 million of people were affected by. So looking at these numbers, we are facing a reality that is posing a real threat to the role of the humanitarians in terms of dealing with such magnitude of events, of impact to the life, especially of the most vulnerable. And if we will not receive the right feedback, if we will not be a concrete action after the COP26, of course, we will have very serious consequences in terms of having hundreds of millions by 2050 in terrible needs of humanitarian assistance. And this is something that we cannot afford in terms of our ability to operate, in terms of the needs of financial support that would be needed to cope with these challenges. And about the specific risk, so there is no one. Honestly, if I look one perspective, because there are many risks compounded and linked to the climate change. The main one, if I look at just about the migration, so how many millions of people will be forced to leave their houses, their land, their families, because the consequences of climate change. This is something that will be unpredictable, but the scientists are saying that desertifications, extreme events will be really increased, as I said. So this is one of the main one in terms of bringing together with these people on the move, social instability, and all the other risks linked to the migration. And also, even now, we are having a lot of difficulty in engaging with the governments about the respect that is needed also to those who are forced to leave their land because the consequences of climate change. So if we look at this, maybe this is the most important one, and but I think that it will be really difficult to cope if the countries and the government will not act during the COP26, and we will not see a concrete commitment followed by a real action after Glasgow.
Yeah, I mean, the unpredictability that you mentioned of the kind of a hybrid crisis that is the sort of bubbling up as a result of climate change and kind of compounding each other is something I hear a lot as a journalist, that, you know, really kind of worries people in the humanitarian and development sectors. And obviously it's an old sector, it's been going a long time, and is sometimes criticized for not changing with the times enough. So how does the IFRC and the sector in general fit into responding to these crises? What can your organization do, and what can the sector be doing more generally to respond and to meet these challenges?
This is a very interesting question, because of course we have to be humble. No? The first instinct in answering that, oh, of course we are ready. No one will be ready if we look at the real magnitude of the impact of the climate change that the scientists are predicting. So in a humble way, I answer, I don't know. We will know then if we will have to act on the ground. But by the way, I think the International Federation, especially its 192 members, we are working on the ground. So maybe we are really well positioned if we as humanitarians, so not only the Red Cross pillar, but all the humanitarians, we will really be able to focus on the localization process, to put at the center the local actors. This will be the key together with the adaptation. Are the two key words to face the consequences of the climate change. So in terms of fitting with this challenge, my answer is yes. We are, I think, in terms of awareness, we are ready. I don't know if we will be in terms of the financial sustainability, because will depend from the donors, from our stakeholders, and in terms of the support that they will provide to all of us. But in terms of preparation, watching about the role that the volunteers are having on the ground, the role that they are playing in dealing with their own communities, I think that we as a Red Cross, Red Crescent families, especially the national societies, are really ready, unfortunately, because we have to add unfortunately with this crisis. So this is it in terms of this. I think that we have to be honest that after the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, we didn't see a real advancement in the dialogue about the localization process in the humanitarian field. And this is something that we must continue with. The dialogue must continue, because there are a lot of resistances in having this dialogue, even in the humanitarian sector. We have to be very, very transparent on this, while at the same moment it is key to succeed the localization process and the grand bargain in general terms.
It's really interesting to hear someone in leadership positions admit that they don't quite know what's going to happen. It's not something we hear so often from leaders. So I appreciate your honesty there. What is it about the localization agenda and local communities that makes that is so important in responding in practical terms to the climate crisis?
This is a lesson learned. We have to learn from the experiences. This is why I'm so humble in answering to this. The lesson learned from the past is that only through the role of the local actors we can make a difference at local communities. Because when we talk about people affected by a disaster, now we are talking about the consequences and the disaster related to the climate change. But in general terms, those who are the first responders are the expression of the local community, and this is why we think that this is the key at the local action, because the dialogue at a local level with the local institution in terms of preparedness, in terms of being able, when we talk about this I think sometimes even inflection word that is resilience. This must happen at local level. So this is why it's so important that this becomes something in the DNA of the humanitarianism, but also for the donors and the governments in watching to our sector when they engage in the dialogue with us. It's a cultural change that we do need it happen, because it's vital for especially for the most vulnerable communities. And but even in the Western country, when we look what has happened in Germany a few weeks ago, so it is at the local level that then the first responders have to work when a disaster strike, and in terms of preparation, in terms of to be ready when floods happen. Just as an example, it's there that you do need to be prepared to analyze the ground and if the community will be able to cope and survive after a disaster. So we are continuing this dialogue involving also not only the national institution, but also the local institution through our thousands of local branches of our national societies. And this is something that must continue through the support of the government, and hoping that during the COP26 will be paid enough attention to this in terms of preparation.
You mentioned a cultural change there in terms of the localization agenda, and it seems increasingly clear that we're in a very polarized and increasingly fractured kind of world. How does one go about doing that, or the sector go about achieving that in the kind of more competitive geopolitical environment? And does it need to come from the top, or does it need to be more of a bottom-down effort?
Both. This is, I think, that we have to meet, because we have to admit that in this very polarized world, the role of the political leaders sometimes it seems to me very weak, and it seems that too often they are following the fears of the people, or feeding the fears sometime, looking in general terms, not only talking about the climate change, of course, but even on this, that not engaging in a real dialogue, with them. So generally talking, I have to admit that is difficult for us sometimes, especially when it's polarized, but also the humanitarian issues or the scientific evidences are subjects to the political divide, and this is unacceptable. So you cannot question the scientific evidences. Why, and when this happens, it has consequences on the life of people. So, but when the society is so divided and so polarized, as you rightly said, it is difficult also for us to really engage. And the result is this: what I now has become a mantra, like something that I often repeat. A lot of statements, a fruitful meeting, fruitful, inspiring meeting, but then without concrete facts. Even when we fully disagree, then the outcome is the fruitful meeting. But this is not the reality, especially when it comes about the life of the people, and especially when it comes about the climate change, or during these people about COVID-19 and how to deal with the vaccine equity, just to mention another example. And then too many people is losing their lives, or is a risk because this inaction or political division.
Yeah. Bringing it back to COP, what do you think should be the key objectives of the humanitarian sector for COP? What would be, a success in humanitarian terms to emerge from this summit?
Okay, first, let me say, as a citizen of the world, there are two aspects. So the first one is the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions, and this is something that we do expect. But this is not enough, because we know that we will have consequences for many years. So in terms of investing in preparedness and in early action is something that is part of the cultural change that we were discussing before, and increasing finance for these. That having a real target on the most vulnerable and the least developed countries, because they are those who are less responsible of the greenhouse gas emissions, but they are paying the highest consequences of it. So this would be the perfect combination. And then let's hope not only about the official outcome and the official statement, but also then after the commitment that will be made, I hope, in the COP, the real action. So let's see in the following weeks and months, not years, because we cannot wait years, about concrete action to really transform the way we have dealt so far with the climate change, empowering the local communities, empowering the local actors in the humanitarian sector, and also finally one of the important requests that we underline is also related to the conflicts. This is we released a statement together with my colleague Peter Maurer about the protection of the environment, because too often in the conflict areas the environment is severely affected, and once again those who are paying the consequences of these are the most vulnerable and losing their livelihoods and the opportunity to survive.
Francesco, thank you so much. 15 minutes is just not enough, but moving from talk to action to transformation is not just a key desire of the humanitarian sector for this COP. I think it's something that spreads across different sectors. I hope everyone at home enjoyed watching this. You can subscribe to the Devex Newswire. A link should be popping up. I'd just like to thank you again, President Roca, for your time with us today, and thank you all at home for joining us.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for the opportunity to Devex. Thank you so much.
Good day, everyone. My name is Rumbi Chakamba. I'm an associate editor here at Devex, and COP26 is well underway. Today, I'm joined by Adrian Martinez, the director for La Ruta del Clima from Costa Rica, to discuss how inclusive COP really is. Thank you, Adrian, for joining me.
Thank you, Rumbi. It's a pleasure to join and talk about the right of public participation at the climate conference.
Okay, so the UK has dubbed COP26 as the most inclusive COP ever. But in the lead up to the summit, to the conference itself, there were complaints that COP cannot be inclusive due to travel restrictions and that vulnerable countries may not actually be able to get their voice heard. Now that the COP is underway, what do you think? Would we say that the UK has done enough to ensure that many people are actually able to attend COP26?
So that's a very interesting question. I think one of the issues that we have to take on account is, first of all, it is a hard condition, a hard situation in light of COVID-19. So that's something that we have to take on account. But also, it's not only about what is happening now, but what has happened in the past years and also in the recent months before COP26. It is not new, and we saw it in COP24 and COP25. Public participation being severely limited or disregarded by the UNFCCC Bureau and when they make decision makings about participation mechanisms. So now with COP26 is a new example of this sort of logic where public participation is addressed not as a human right, but something that may or may not be considered when the decisions are taken. And during the months before, what we saw is that first, we knew COP was a humongous challenge, especially for the global south. There is a huge inequality on access of vaccines, and that was something that we were very concerned. We were very concerned on the health issues, and what we experienced is either it could go in two ways: either a systemic logic of discriminating people based on their origin that we saw with the issue of color coding, for example, that it became a huge issue before COP and then suddenly it disappeared, which makes us wonder what was the logic of hampering and discouraging participation based on colors of sort of this chart of COVID, and then simply that was no longer a matter. And then, for example, the issue of requiring a quarantine without being certain that you could have the funds to pay it, and then getting the support to pay it, and then eliminating the quarantine also was completely. And then at the same time, as that's something being, I think that could be possible, leaving stranded many people without lodging because they counted on the 7-day quarantine to be at UK, and then not having the resources to pay for that, or having to change planes, or having to find funding. So there has been a sequential series of events that either are a show of systemic structural inhibition of participation by the UK presidency, or a simply lack of context and understanding of what are the hurdles and obstacles and social and economic challenges that people and observers from the global south have to participate in a climate conference. And regularly that implies lots of funding, lots of effort, lots of visa processes that are extremely stressful and that are not easy to go to any COP. And it's something that we know from the UNFCCC itself, that there is a significant imbalance of representation in terms of regional participations of civil society and even from parties. There's the different amounts of people or representatives by region, either by parties or UNFCCC observers, varies drastically between the global south and the global north.
So you mentioned this a very confusing process. Like there were a lot of restrictions in the beginning. They were sort of taken care of, and in the end, it's like, okay, it's now easier for you to go. But do you think this whole process discouraged people from going, and that we'll see less people from the global south actually attending COP26 at the end of this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have cases of people right now trying to board a plane, for example, a colleague from Haiti, and the airline simply do not acknowledging that he has a right to to go to COP, even though he fulfills all the requirements, and having to wait 2 days just fighting with the airline to get on a plane. And that is like right now. And so even the issue is that even if the requirements of obstacles are lifted and were lifted eventually in this long process, the degree of uncertainty and this sort of back and forth of decision making without some sort of organization or pre-plan that can only lead you to think that people that were making the decision lack the context of how people in the global south have to go through barriers and requirements to move through international borders, especially in the context of COVID, or it is just a means to sort of reduce the amount of people from the global south participating. And in either way is very stressful and very important to acknowledge the situation, because having people from the global south also shifts the priorities in the agenda. People in Africa, people in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, in Latin America have certain political expectations of COP26. And when you reduce the already traditionally a small percentage of people from these regions advocating and participating and supporting their delegation at COP26, that shifts the influence and generates undue influence by the already big presence of the global north within COP26, and that sort of end up guiding where COP26 will lead us in terms of results. And that is something that is very worrisome, that affects the right of political participation and affects the exercise and protection of the human right to a healthy environment.
Yeah, I think there was always this agreement that it's important for people from the global south to attend, but there was also a bit of disagreement on what should happen. Some civil society organizations called for the postponement of COP, while others said we need to go ahead, we need to have these discussions this year, and we need to have them in person, and the support should be granted. What do you think was the best way forward? The decision has been made, but what do you think was the best way forward? Should it have been postponed, or should we have just gone ahead with discussions?
Well, to be honest, many the networks that we support, there was an agreement of many NGOs about suspending, because clearly, as we can see, there is a huge risk of health, and the UK was unable to guarantee a safe and inclusive COP, and that is a fact. I mean, that is something that is undeniable. But on the other hand, coming from a Central American NGO to wait and still face the threat of climate impacts and loss and damage in our vulnerable communities sort of leave us also with no choice about which option to take. They're both awful. They're both risking lives. They are both destroying our community. And we urgently need climate negotiations to move forward. So what we needed is a human-based approach to COP26, one that takes into account not only our right to have a healthiest place, but also to guarantee, and the UK as being part of the Aarhus Convention, and the other 71 countries that are also part to Access Rights Agreement have pre-existing obligations in terms of human rights to guarantee and to establish and notify a mechanism of participation that ensures effective participation of civil society. So what we expect, at least from our side, is just our rights are respected. We needed a COP that take into account the urgency of the climate emergency, but also our human right to be protected and to participate. And that is sort of what did not happen. So it's not an either or sort of situation where you can say one was the best. The thing is that it should have been done better, and it should have been done with a better contextual understanding and a little bit less of privilege in those that are making decisions, or understanding the realities of people across the globe. And in my understanding, that's either where the sort of analysis can end. Either it is a systemic tool of discrimination to reduce participation on the UK presidency, or simply a complete lack of understanding due to privilege and colonialism of what are the realities of people in the global south. So, I mean, you can have a pick at something. I think there isn't an answer, but the fact is that participation has not been respected, and the degree of lack of facilities for people to be protected and not be crowded at the COP26 is also a fact. So it's sort of more a subjective opinion for me in which of those two is closer to what is going on right now.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned was the participation of civil society. There've also been concerns that civil society is not being allowed to observe negotiations now that the conference is underway. And there's also news that has been addressed. Do you think enough is being done to allow civil society participation and they're being given enough access?
So participation on the first 2 days was completely non-existent. They took an approach of prioritizing the role of billionaires, the role of royalty, the role of presidents rather than the public, and on participating in not only on the high-level events, which are sort of for those people that hold power in the world, but also in the informal negotiations that took place during those events. And that we were completely excluded, not only because the web platform failed, but because NGOs, for example, the constituencies were only allowed 4 spots to participate and enter the more than 2/3 of the venue that were closed for those in power and leaving the public outside. So meaning that, for example, the Climate Action Network, which is half of the environmental constituency, only had 2 spots for more than 1,500 NGOs that are members to participate in the informal discussions of negotiations that took place during those 2 days. And then in terms of being able to participate, it's still a challenge because we're 2 days late, and many of our observers, for example, at least from Latin America, are still just arriving because of challenges of cost and logistical arrangement. So it's been challenged to participate. It's something that now, at least that the venue has been freed from the closures that it had on the 2 days, we're trying to catch up and try to engage and into the process that has been developed without us since the beginning.
So we're now a few days into the conference, like you mentioned, and you spoke of this power imbalance that's been there for such a long time, and you spoke of systemic discrimination. What can civil society do to ensure that the voices are heard and that the voices of the people are actually heard within the short space of time that's left?
Well, I mean, that's something that for this COP and in future COPs, we have to remember that there are 72 parties of the UNFCCC that have in human rights obligations in terms of access rights. And they have an obligation to promote the right of public participation principles within the UNFCCC as well as in any other international forum. And that is something that should be done in terms of the organizing. And the UK had a human rights obligation based on the Aarhus Conventions to fulfill the Almaty guidelines in terms of guaranteeing participation within the COP. That is a failure that they have to own, and they have to reassess on how do they address public participation in their country and also in international forums. And for us, is from civil society, what we have to is engage from a rights perspective. It is our right to engage in the decision making, to influence it, not only to be there, to be part of the decision and have some say in how it's taken and have our input duly considered. And that is sort of what is participating. And it's not just watching or having one seat amongst many. And also, I mean, just basic things. I mean, how could you have negotiations with 192 parties but only 144 seats? I mean, it's just a common sense sort of logistical arrangements that have to be taken into account. And also you have hundreds of observers that should be part of those negotiations. And that's something that has to be changed. And we as NGOs have to demand our rights, and our right to a healthy environment and a right to public participation and environmental decision making is something that we should point out as a must-have for any negotiations within the UNFCCC. And the Secretariat of the UNFCCC has to still begin addressing public participation as a human right, and not just like a token or interesting tool to improve governance, but as a right that the observers and that the public in general have.
So that is a fail on inclusivity for you. But in terms of COP26, what outcomes would you like to actually see come out of the conference? And do you think that's still possible without the participation that we wanted to see?
Well, it's always possible because it's people making decisions, and parties have obligations already to fulfill, either due to international law or due to the Paris Agreement or human rights. And what we expect, at least, it's a decision on Article 6, which is the core of the Paris Agreement in terms of mitigation, that duly takes on account human rights approach. But we also know and require a greater role and a permanent agenda on loss and damage within the UNFCCC. And for that, we need to establish funding and a systemic response on the climate impacts and the losses and damage that our vulnerable communities are having. That is not in the agenda, but that's a political ask that from civil society we require. Also, we have to understand that even though there's an agenda that is being officially led, there's also needs that the global south is positioning within COP26. And for a successful COP, it's not only the agenda items that have to be successful, but that the COP26 and the parties have to acknowledge the need that people have in the territories and the communities, and having some sort of financial result in terms of loss and damage beyond the Santiago network and what this is being developed there. It's something that is quite important for Global South NGOs.
Thank you so much for joining me, Adrian. We've actually unfortunately come to the end of our conversation, which was a really fascinating conversation. We will be looking out for those outcomes from COP, and we'll be looking out for more inclusivity in the following COPs to come. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for Devex at COP26. I wanted to thank again our innovation ecosystem partner, DI UK, and our ecosystem partners, AGRA, Catapult, Center for Disaster Protection, ESRI, and RTI International, and our underwriter, FHI 360, again, for making this coverage possible. But I'm really excited because right now I'm joined with Devex correspondent Paul Adepoju, who has been here in Glasgow since the very beginning of last week. He's still standing after running around everywhere. So Paul, it's so nice to have you here with us today. I'd love to hear, what are your kind of takeaways from the conversations you've been having this past week plus now?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think something that is quite obvious that is popping out from all the conversations is that it's not something that is easy to get everybody to be on board. The way the agreement of the Paris Agreement was structured, and the conversation and the dialogue, the negotiation, I was made to realize that all the countries have to agree on every item before it is passed. And so which is becoming really, really serious, with different countries trying to set different benchmarks on when and how the target will be achieved. We also see conversations around countries, rich countries owning up to their contribution to climate change, because the fact, if once they own up, it simply means that they are duty bound to correct it. So we are seeing lots of negotiations around the wordings, exact wordings of how this is going to happen. But on the bright side, we're also seeing lots of announcements, lots of ambitious goals being set by collaborations and connections of different organizations and countries coming together to actually say that we are going to achieve this by so and so. Yeah, and something that also is quite unique about this COP is that it is increasingly becoming more obvious that the private sector has much more bigger roles to play in achieving those goals. So while the rich countries struggle to come up with $100 billion, we are seeing the private sector being asked to come up with hundreds of trillions. Going forward, I think this is seen as a way to actually move forward.
Yeah, so you talk about all the countries coming together and needing to come to an agreement. There's been a lot of criticism about leaving out a lot of the countries that are most impacted by climate crisis, yes. The lower middle income countries, LDCs. Do you think that skepticism is founded? Is there hope for optimism from what you've seen so far today? What do you expect to see? What would you say to the critics that are looking at this, wondering if we're really centering those nations and people that are going to be most impacted and are currently most impacted by climate?
Yeah, I agree with you on that sentiment, and I think those sentiments are well founded. There was a time I was asking, I was interviewing somebody that has been that this COP26 is a seventh, and he said what is happening is nothing, is not unique. That promises like that are being made. There is also this concern about this particular COP26 not being too inclusive. We don't really have free access to everything to everybody. So while that is the case, what we just can see is let's see what the final wordings of the deliberations will be. Every country has a request. Every country has its set of demands, what they believe would be in their best interest. And if such cannot be actually, if they cannot marshal it, we see small countries coming together. We see interest groups coming together. African countries are not negotiating on their own. They have a group of negotiators that they are coming together. Individually, they may not be strong, but when they come together, there is unity in strength. So that is what we see happening. Yeah, like I said, it's a lot to pack in, but we are going to have an indication whether all these concerns are part of what they are addressed in the final wordings. But we still have to be optimistic because we've always known that this is how the debate is going to be quite complex. Yeah, we just take what we have, what we can get from here and move on.
Yeah, no, there is a lot to unpack, a lot that's been happening across the city the past week plus. So what are the stories you will want to continue afterwards? What are you going to be keeping an eye on and holding these leaders and private sector and these commitments to account?
Okay, quite a lot. One thing that was quite unique about this COP26 is being described as the first COP to actually bring health to the center. Before we didn't have a health-focused platform at previous COPs, but that is happening here, and there is still the need. Those health stakeholders are calling for a day to be set aside to actually talk about health in the context of climate change, because one of the things that we believe is going to happen is if climate change begins to be seen from the perspective of healthcare, that this is also an health emergency. Look at how the world was able to quickly mobilize resources and efforts together to address COVID-19. But we are seeing reluctance. The world spent trillions of dollars to quickly address COVID-19, but climate change, they are struggling to come up with 100 billion. So we are going to see how the conversations around moving to the healthcare will be regarded. Then we also look at the seriousness of the United States government about trying to convince everybody that it's back on track. We have President Biden's ambitious promises. We also have President Barack Obama was here yesterday trying to energize and trying to say that, okay, my predecessors did this. Yes, we are fully on track. Yeah, the world is listening. The partners are working, looking at what the insights will be. And I think what we've learned is that how will these conversations around climate change, the actions that need to be taken, will be regarded and be taken serious, irrespective of who is in power. And we also have the influence from China and the Russia and the Saudi Arabian government. And of course, all eyes will also be on what happens in Egypt, because Egypt is hosting the next COP26 and is trying to also garner effort and convince the rest of the world that it is taking climate change, renewable energy, and other climate change buzzwords quite serious. So a lot of things to keep track of. Yeah,
and a conversation today is that this isn't a conversation that should be happening once a year. It should be happening every day.
Exactly.
So we will be continuing this conversation in our coverage tomorrow. Also, make sure you're subscribed to Devex Newswire, where we'll have even more coverage of the event and what's happening over the next few days. So we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. GMT, for our continued coverage of COP26. But Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.